My daughter-in-law, 7 months pregnant, was kicked out of our house in the rain. 3 days later, her lawyer called. I remember the sound most of all. Not shouting, my wife doesn't shout, not really. She just gets quiet and precise, which is somehow worse. What I remember is the rain hitting the porch roof, and the sound of the front door closing, and Emily standing on our driveway at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, one hand on her stomach, the other holding a duffel bag she'd packed in about 4 minutes flat. I stood in the hallway and did nothing. That's the part one have to live with. Not what my wife said to her. What I didn't say back. 3 days later, a woman named Denise Callahan called our house, introduced herself as legal counsel representing Emily Hensley, and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss a matter that would significantly affect our family's financial position going forward. I laughed, actually. I thought it was a mistake, or a bluff, or some overreaction from an upset young woman with more pride than leverage. I had no idea, standing in my kitchen with that phone against my ear, just how wrong I was about to be. My name is Robert Hensley. I'm 62 years old, and for 30 years I ran Hensley & Cole, a mid-sized construction and property development firm here in Ohio that my own father started with 2 trucks and a line of credit he barely qualified for. I built it into something respectable, 40 employees, a decent reputation, enough success that people in this town knew our name and, for the most part, respected it. I raised one son, Daniel, alongside my wife, Margaret. Margaret came from a family that valued appearances almost as much as substance. Her father had been a bank vice president, her mother active in every charity board worth being seen on. Margaret ran our household the way her mother ran committees, with precision, control, and very clear ideas about who fit where. Daniel met Emily during his last year of college. She'd grown up about 40 minutes from us, raised mostly by her grandmother after her mother passed young, and her father, a man Emily rarely spoke about, had been out of the picture since she was a child. She worked 2 jobs through school, waited tables on weekends, and by the time Daniel brought her home for the first time, she had a quiet, careful way about her that I initially mistook for shyness. It wasn't shyness. I understand that now. It was the caution of someone who'd learned, early and hard, that not every room was safe to relax in. Margaret's first impression of her was polite on the surface and dismissive underneath, the way Margaret's impressions of people often were. She's sweet, Margaret told me after that first dinner. But she's not really our kind of people, is she? It wasn't a question. It was a verdict, delivered the way Margaret delivered most things, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself back then that it wasn't my place to argue. Daniel loved her. That should have been enough. For me, honestly, it mostly was I liked Emily. She was smart, sharper than she let on in front of Margaret, quick with a joke when she felt comfortable enough to make one. But I also let Margaret's coolness toward her become the household default, the same way water finds the lowest point without anyone deciding it should. I never corrected it. I just let it settle. Daniel and Emily married 4 years ago, a small ceremony that Margaret found, in her words, sweet, for what it was. Another one of those compliments that left a mark shaped exactly like an insult. They moved into the guest house on our property while Daniel worked his way up in the family business, and they saved for a place of their own. It made sense financially. It also meant Emily spent 4 years living 20 yards from a mother-in-law who never fully accepted her, in a house that legally belonged to Margaret and me. I want to be honest about something, the same way I've had to be honest with myself since all of this happened. I wasn't cruel to Emily. I was, by most measures, kind to her. I asked about her days, complimented her cooking, defended her mildly when Margaret's comments got too pointed. But I never did more than mildly. I never once, in 4 years, sat Margaret down and said, "This has to stop." I told myself I was keeping the peace. I understand now that keeping the peace and protecting Emily were 2 very different jobs, and I only ever did the first one. Emily was 7 months pregnant with our first grandchild when things came to a head. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in town, quiet, reliable work that never came up much at family dinners, because Margaret had long ago decided it wasn't the kind of career worth asking follow-up questions about. I never asked follow-up questions either. That's a detail that matters more than I realized at the time. The pregnancy, if anything, seemed to sharpen Margaret's edges rather than soften them. She'd make comments about how things would need to change once the baby came, about proper preparation, about whether Emily and Daniel were really ready for this kind of responsibility. Comments that always seemed to circle back, one way or another, to the idea that Emily wasn't quite up to the standard Margaret expected for a Hensley grandchild. I told myself every single time that I'd say something eventually, that there'd be a right moment. I kept waiting for that moment for 4 years. It arrived, finally, on a Tuesday night in October in the middle of a rainstorm, though not in the way I ever imagined, and not in a way that gave me the chance to be the man I'd always told myself I secretly was, underneath all that quiet accommodation. By the time that night was over, my daughter-in-law was standing in our driveway with a duffel bag, 7 months pregnant, in the rain, and I had said nothing. 3 days after that, everything I thought I understood about her, and about my own family, started to come apart. The trouble that night started small, the way it always did with Margaret. It started over a guest list. We were hosting a dinner for some of Hensley and Cole's most important clients. A deal Daniel had been working for months. A contract that would have meant real growth for the company. Margaret had planned the evening down to the last detail, as she always did, and 2 days before, she pulled Emily aside in the kitchen while I was refilling my coffee in the next room, close enough to hear everything. "I think it might be best if you sit this one out," Margaret said. "Sit it out." Emily's voice was careful, controlled. "I thought I was helping with the seating arrangements." "I mean the dinner itself," Margaret said. "These are important clients, Emily. Investors. People who need to see Hensley and Cole as a serious, established family, polished, put together. I just think, given everything..." A pause I could practically hear her gesture through, at Emily's stomach, at the general condition of being 7 months pregnant and tired and swollen-ankled. "It might be easier on you to just take the evening for yourself. Rest. We'll bring you a plate after." "You want me to hide in the guest house during a family business dinner?" Emily said. Not a question. A statement, flat and precise, the exact tone Margaret usually used on other people. "I want you to be comfortable," Margaret said, which we both knew wasn't true. I should have walked into that kitchen right then. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't the moment. We had clients arriving in 2 days, and I didn't want a family conflict hanging over the house before the dinner. I told myself, the way I always told myself, that I'd address it later, privately, calmly. The dinner happened. Emily didn't come. Daniel, torn between his mother and his wife the way he'd been torn for 4 years, spent the evening distracted, apologizing to Emily by text between courses, which satisfied no one. 2 nights later, the rain started around 6 and hadn't let up by 9. Daniel was working late at the office, finalizing paperwork from the client dinner. Emily came into the main house to use the good printer in my study. The guest house's printer had been broken for a week, something small and unremarkable that, in hindsight, was the spark for everything that followed. Margaret found her there. I was in the next room at my desk, and I heard the whole thing the way you hear an argument through a wall when you already know, deep down, you should be standing in the doorway instead. "What are you doing in here?" Margaret asked. "Printing something for the accounting firm," Emily said. "Our printer's broken. I mentioned it last week. You could have asked." "I did ask. I texted you Tuesday. You said it was fine." There was a pause, the kind Margaret used when she'd been caught in something and needed a second to redirect. "Well, regardless," she said, "I don't love the idea of you going through Robert's study unsupervised. There are client files in here, financial documents. I'm sure you understand why that makes me uncomfortable. I want you to understand what was actually being said in that moment, because it took me embarrassingly long to understand it myself." Margaret wasn't worried about client files. Margaret was telling my very pregnant daughter-in-law, after 4 years of marriage into this family, that she wasn't trusted enough to be alone in a room with paperwork. Emily's voice, when she answered, had an edge to it I'd never heard from her before. 4 years of careful, controlled patience finally cracking. "You think I'm going to steal something? I'm 7 months pregnant, Margaret. I'm printing a bank reconciliation for a client with a Thursday deadline. I'm not casing your study. There's no need for that tone. There's every need for that tone. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is?" living 20 feet from someone who spent 4 years deciding I'm not good enough to sit through a client dinner or print a document without supervision. That's when I should have walked in. I was already standing, already moving toward the doorway. I remember that clearly because it's the part that haunts me most. I was 30 seconds from actually doing something, and Margaret got there first in the worst possible way. "If that's genuinely how you feel," Margaret said, her voice going flat and cold in the way it did right before she said something designed to end a conversation permanently, "then maybe it's time you and Daniel found your own place. Tonight, even. I think we could all use some space." "It's pouring rain," Emily said, and for the first time, I heard something crack in her voice. Not anger anymore, just disbelief. "I'm 7 months pregnant, Margaret. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before speaking to me that way in my own home." I walked into that study exactly as Emily picked up her bag. A bag I later learned she'd quietly kept half-packed in the guest house closet for months, which told me more about how she'd been living under our roof than any conversation ever could have. "Margaret," I said, "this has gone too far. It's raining. She's pregnant. Nobody's going anywhere tonight." Margaret turned to me, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not softening, but recalculating. The way it did when she realized she had an audience for a decision she'd already made. "Robert, stay out of this. This is between me and her. It's my house too," I said, and even as I said it, I heard how weak it sounded. 4 years of silence trying to compress itself into one sentence. Too little, decades too late. Emily looked at me then. Not at Margaret. At me. "You've had 4 years to say something, Robert," she said quietly. "Just now doesn't count." She walked past both of us, out the front door, into the rain, duffel bag over one shoulder, hand braced against her lower back the way pregnant women do when their body's carrying more than it was built for. I stood in the hallway and watched through the window as she called Daniel, standing under our porch light because there was nowhere else to stand, waiting for her husband to come get her from the house his own parents had just put her out of. I did nothing. I want to say that plainly, because it's the truest thing in this entire story. I stood in my own hallway in my own home and did absolutely nothing, while my pregnant daughter-in-law waited in the rain for a ride away from a family that had never fully let her in. Daniel came home 40 minutes later, soaked, furious in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him. The careful diplomat who'd spent 4 years trying to keep everyone happy, finally, completely out of patience. He didn't yell. He just packed a bag of his own, told us he and Emily would be staying with her grandmother until they figured out next steps, and left without really looking at either of us. Margaret spent the next 2 days acting as though nothing unusual had happened, the way she often did after moments like this, a kind of practiced amnesia I'd witnessed for 39 years of marriage and never once fully challenged. I spent those 2 days in a strange, quiet kind of shame, replaying the study, the driveway, the porch light, trying to understand how I'd let 4 years of small accommodations build into a night where I watched a pregnant woman stand in the rain and said nothing until it was already too late to matter. I had no idea that 2 days of shame was about to turn into something else entirely, because on the third day, the phone rang, and a woman named Denise Callahan asked to speak with me about a matter that would, in her words, significantly affect our family's financial position going forward. "Mr. Hensley, thank you for taking my call," Denise Callahan said, her voice pleasant, professional, giving away nothing. "I represent Emily Hensley in a legal capacity. I wanted to reach out directly as a courtesy, before this became a more formal conversation." "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely confused. "A legal capacity regarding what exactly?" "I assume you're aware that Emily's biological father was Walter Iverson." The name meant something to me immediately, though it took a moment to place why. Walter Iverson, a name that appeared occasionally in local business news over the years. A quiet, reclusive man who'd built a substantial commercial property portfolio across 3 counties, including, I would learn in the next several minutes, a controlling interest in the very industrial park where Hensley and Cole leased our primary warehouse and equipment yard. A lease that had been, for 6 years, the single largest fixed cost in our entire operating budget. "I know the name," I said slowly. "I didn't know he was Emily's father. She never talks about her father." "For good reason," Denise said. "He wasn't in her life. He left when she was 3, had almost no contact with her mother's family afterward, and Emily grew up believing he wanted nothing to do with her. What she didn't know, what none of us knew until his estate was formally opened last month, is that Walter Iverson spent the last decade of his life quietly tracking his daughter's life from a distance. Her graduation, her marriage, this pregnancy. He never reached out directly, but he updated his will 4 times in the last 8 years, each time to reflect where she was in her life. I sat down. I remember that specifically because my legs genuinely didn't feel steady enough to stay standing. Walter Iverson passed away 6 weeks ago, Denise continued. Emily is his sole surviving heir. That includes his full commercial property portfolio, including his controlling interest in Meridian Business Park, where I understand Hensley and Cole currently leases its main facility. I want to describe honestly what went through me in that moment because it wasn't simple. Part of it was pure shock, the kind that makes a room feel briefly unreal. Part of it, and I'm not proud of this, was a fast, ugly calculation running somewhere underneath the shock. Our lease, our largest fixed cost, now controlled by the daughter-in-law my wife had put out in the rain 3 nights earlier. Mrs. Callahan, I said carefully. Why exactly are you calling me? 2 reasons, she said. First, as a courtesy. Emily wanted you to hear this from a lawyer, calmly, rather than have it emerge some other way. She specifically asked me to make that clear. Second, because Meridian Business Park's ownership transition means all existing commercial leases are subject to a standard review clause, and given recent events, Emily wanted to be direct with you about how she plans to handle Hensley and Cole's lease going forward. And how does she plan to handle it? There was a pause on the line, not a hostile one, just measured. She asked me to tell you this in her own words, actually. Would you like me to read it? Please. Denise read from what I understood later was a short statement Emily had written herself, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen 3 days after standing in our rain-soaked driveway. Robert, I'm not calling to threaten your business or punish your family. I'm calling because I think you deserve to hear the truth directly, the same way I deserved to hear it directly 4 years ago, and never did. I'm not interested in revenge. I am interested in never again being someone who gets decided about instead of talked to. Your lease will be handled fairly and professionally, the same way I'd want to be treated by anyone with power over my life. But fair doesn't mean pretending Tuesday night didn't happen. I need you to understand that. I sat in my kitchen, phone against my ear, and felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Genuine, complete shame, undiluted by any of the small justifications I'd been quietly offering myself for 4 years. I asked Denise if I could speak with Emily directly. She said Emily would consider it in time but wasn't ready yet, and asked that I respect that. I did. It was, I think, the first thing I'd actually done right in this entire story. I told Margaret everything that evening. She went very quiet, quieter than I'd seen her in years, and for the first time in our marriage, I watched her sit with a consequence instead of immediately reorganizing the story to make it smaller. I didn't know, she said finally, about her father, about any of it. That's not really the point, Margaret, I said, and it was strange, hearing myself say something like that to her after 39 years of mostly letting her steer these conversations. The point is what you did know. You knew she was 7 months pregnant. You knew it was raining. And you told her to leave anyway, over a printer. It wasn't about the printer, and we both understood that. It was about 4 years of small, cumulative decisions that had convinced Margaret, somewhere along the way, that Emily was a guest in our family rather than a permanent part of it. Someone who could be managed, minimized, and eventually removed if she became inconvenient enough. I didn't hear from Emily directly for almost 3 weeks. I didn't push. I'd spent 4 years failing to give her the one thing she actually needed from me. A voice used at the right moment on her behalf, and I wasn't going to compound that by demanding she forgive me on my timeline instead of hers. When she finally called, it wasn't about the lease, or the business, or Walter Iverson's fortune. It was about the baby. I'm due in 8 weeks, she said. Daniel wants you both at the hospital. I told him that's between the 3 of you to figure out. I'm not going to be the reason you're kept away from your grandchild. But I need you to understand something first, Robert, and I need you to actually hear it this time. I'm listening. I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't quite managed to mean it in 4 years of half listening while Margaret talked over her. I don't need you to fix everything overnight, she said. I don't need grand gestures. What I needed, every single time Margaret made a comment or drew a line or made me feel like a guest in my own home, was for you to say something in the moment. Not later. Not after I've already packed a bag. In the moment. That's the only thing that would have actually mattered. I told her she was right, and I didn't try to soften it or explain it away. We spoke for a long while after that, the first real conversation I realized that we'd had in 4 years without Margaret's expectations sitting somewhere in the room with us. The lease negotiation, when it eventually happened, was handled exactly the way Denise Callahan had promised. Fairly, professionally, no favors and no punishment, terms in line with every other tenant in Meridian Business Park. Emily never once used her position to pressure or embarrass us, which, given everything, was a level of restraint I'm not certain I would have managed in her position. Margaret's relationship with Emily didn't heal quickly, and I won't pretend it became easy. But something shifted after that October night, a recognition on Margaret's part that the daughter-in-law she'd spent 4 years quietly dismissing had more dignity, more restraint, and ultimately more power than either of us had ever bothered to notice. Margaret started asking real questions slowly, awkwardly at first, about Emily's work, her father, her life before Daniel. The kind of questions that should have come naturally 4 years earlier and instead had to be relearned from scratch. I made my own changes too. I started speaking up in the moment, the actual moment, not the rehearsed apology afterward. Small corrections at first, then larger ones, until it became less something I had to force myself to do and more something that simply felt like being the man I'd always told myself I secretly was. Emily gave birth to a daughter 7 weeks later. Margaret and I were at the hospital in the waiting room, invited but not assuming, a distinction I understood now mattered a great deal. When Emily finally let us in to meet our granddaughter, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Thank you for waiting to be invited," she said. "That's new." It was, I told her, and I intended to keep it that way. My granddaughter is 8 months old now. Emily still runs Meridian Business Park through the trust her father left her, and Hensley and Cole still leases our warehouse there, on the same fair terms as every other tenant. No favors, no resentment, just the ordinary decency I should have offered her from the very beginning, long before any lawyer ever needed to call and remind me of it. I think about that October night often. The rain, the porch light, the 30 seconds I stood in my own hallway deciding whether to speak up. I've learned, since then, that the damage in a family rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It comes from all the quiet moments before it, when someone needed you to say something, and you told yourself later would be soon enough. It wasn't. It almost never is. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from.